So, before starting the lesson, I congratulate you on finishing another major step. We have created UV maps of our character model. We have learned a lot of things about the UVs. And if you have learned that, if you have done all those tasks, fantastic job, you're doing great. Now we can move on to the next step, which is texturing, my favorite part. And before we paint the textures on our 3D model, we will learn a little about materials, shading, and textures in Blender. So let's get into that. Well, this is a quick disclaimer. As we said in the course introduction video, this course is not for complete beginners to Blender. You need to have at least some experience modeling, shading, and rendering in Blender. And if you don't have any of those skills, if you're completely new, it's really hard for you to create characters. And I hope you already have those skills. And if you didn't have those skills, you wouldn't be here. So yeah, that's why in this video, we will talk very briefly about materials. But if you are interested to know more, if you want to go very deep, you can always check out our other courses here. So with that being said, let's continue. Well, in order to make our models look beautiful, we need to apply materials. For example, imagine I have made this cube object, right? And I'd like to take a photo and share on the internet, on Instagram, right? For example. But what kind of model is it? Is it a box? What kind of box? Is it wooden box, metal box, glass, or what? To define that, we apply materials. And the materials are here in Material Editor. And here we see the list of materials which are applied to this object. And we can change the surface properties to change the material properties like the color, the metallic property, roughness, etc. By default, when you open Blender, the default cube will have a material and it's called, well, material. You can rename it by clicking here. You can change it to whatever you want. Now let's change the color quickly, and you don't see it here because in order to be able to see the materials and how they're changing, we need to be in Material Preview shading mode. Let's go there, and now we will see the material color. This is one way of working with materials, but we have other editors and even a workspace which is specific for working with materials, and it's called Shading Workspace. Here you can go there, and your shading workspace might be different than mine. I have just changed it. You see your 3D model here, and you are in Material Preview mode. You can press Z to see that. But more importantly, we have this node editor where we can use different nodes, plug them into each other, and create materials. We have this material output node, which is essential, and this principled BSDF, which is the most common material node. And here we can change a lot of properties like the color, as we did, the metallic property. We can make the object look more like a metal object, the roughness property to make it very smooth and shiny or very rough. We will use the normal property to give extra details. We can use the subsurface property to make it look more like skin. We can also use the transmission property to make it look more like glass. We also have this alpha property which controls the transparency. Another interesting property is this emission, which allows the material to emit light. You can change the color of the light. So yeah, the principled BSDF node, this is a shader node. This gives us almost everything to create complex materials in Blender. And one thing to note here, please make sure that you are using the same Blender version as mine, or maybe newer version. I'm using 4.5 because in older versions of Blender, the principled node is quite different. So the principled BSDF is our main node, but we are going to use a few more nodes in this course, especially for creating hair material. We will be using a lot of different nodes. I will be explaining them. But for now, this information is enough, I guess. Now we will talk about how to apply, how to give, delete materials, how to link materials, etc. So let's bring in a different object, for example, a cylinder. And the cylinder doesn't have any material. How do we create a new material? Well, as you can see, we have new, and let's call it anything. This is our material. By default, it's white. We can change the color, right? Remember, I'm in material preview shading mode. We can have multiple materials on the same object. We can create new material slots by pressing this plus icon and select any slot, create new material there. This is second material. You can create third material and you can change the color there too. But you don't see that color because by default, the first material we created will be applied to all the faces. However, we can apply any material to any face of this object. For that, we can go to edit mode. We can select some faces, select any material from here and press assign. Now we have applied different materials to different faces of this object. And if you want to delete the materials, you can just press the minus icon. You can also change the material to any other material that you have in this blend file. You can also create a new slot and fill this slot with any existing materials. And you will see all the materials in this blend file in this list. You can also search for them. Now let's bring in another mesh object, for example, torus. Now let's talk about linking materials. We can copy the materials of other objects to this. For that, we will select this object first and then the object with the material. Then we will press Ctrl L. You can see we can link different properties. Let's link materials. Now this object has copied the materials of this cube. Now another very useful thing is selecting objects by material. For that we can press Shift L and we can select objects by their material. Let's choose material, and now as you can see we have selected these two objects. And now I will show you how to use image textures in Blender. Let's go to shading again. We can bring in images, image files, right into this shader editor or node editor and plug them into this principled BSDF node to apply them as textures to our material. So these are the textures that I'm going to use to demonstrate how they work. It's actually a texture set, which means one texture with different properties. We are not going to be using only this color information, but we will be using some other information like ambient occlusion, which adds more shadows. We can use the roughness property, which makes certain parts of the material shiny, certain parts more rough. And this amazing normal property, which gives the material depth. And you can simply select some of them, drag and drop into the material editor of Blender, and plug them into the principled BSDF node. So I dropped some of the textures here. So this is diffuse, which means color information. Ambient occlusion, which simulates darker areas like shadows. The roughness, we will plug this into roughness. And the normal, we will use the normal map node. So first of all, let's plug in the color information to base color. Let's actually apply this to a plane. I hope you know how to bring the material back. You can find all the materials you created from here, and it was my material like that. With only this diffuse information, the color information, it doesn't look very much like a brick wall. Try plugging in this roughness information. This is important. Please remember, for color space of roughness and normal, use something other than sRGB because these are not color information. This is a different thing. So we will mostly use non-color as the color space. We will do the same for the normal too. I'm rendering using cycles, but it will look the same in EV2. And if you want to learn more about EV cycles, how they compare to each other, when to use which, etc., please check out our other courses here. So now let's remove the roughness and see what it's doing. So as you can see, it makes things much better immediately. Now the real magic happens with normal maps. So let's test it. Let's bring in normal map node, color to color, normal to normal. Don't forget to change the color space to non-color. Now you can see the shadows which are reacting to the light. Let's compare. This is without normal. This is with normal. You can increase the strength a little. Now let's see what happens when we move the light. This is great for a simple plane to react to light like that without any extra geometry. And this is the power of normal maps. If you plug this off, you see all that detail is gone. If you plug it in, you bring the detail back. And we will be utilizing normal maps in our course. Actually, we will learn how to create normal maps by baking. Well, that was all I wanted to show you in this lesson. Now it's time for quick questions. Now, the quick questions. What are the different tools for working with materials in Blender? Well, we have material properties here where we can manage materials, we can delete, add, we can change the properties, and we have more than that. We have material settings, viewport display, etc. There is a ton of opportunity here, and we also looked at the shading workspace. This is the node editor. We can choose from many nodes here, and here we have material preview. And in order to see the materials, you need to be either in material preview or rendered shading mode. The next question, how do you apply multiple materials to a single mesh object? That was also quite simple. We looked at that. For example, you can add multiple slots, and into each slot you can add new materials. And you can apply each material to different faces of your mesh object. For example, let's change this red to red color. Go to edit mode. You need to select a face, and you can assign a particular material to that face. The next question, how do you copy or link materials and select objects with the same material? Well, if you have an object with materials, you can copy its materials to other objects. For that, you need to select the objects without materials first, and lastly, the object with the materials, and press Ctrl L. You can link many properties along with materials. Let's link the materials. The first material is applied by default, but all materials have been copied there. They are not exactly copies, because if I change the property of the material from here, it will change there too. It's simply one material shared by multiple objects. If you want to have a copy of this material, you can click on this copy button, and now this is a copy. And if you change the color here, it will not change there, because this has the original red material, this has the copy. And you can call it whatever you want, you can change the property, and you can apply it to any face. Now, if you want to select the objects by their material, you can press Shift L and select by material. It didn't select anything because we have this red 001, which is not shared. If I select the blue and press Shift L and material, it will select the other object, which has the exact same material. The next question, what property do you need to change on roughness and normal maps? On roughness and normal maps, we need to change the color space to non-color because they have non-color information. For example, for metallic texture or other textures which are not intended to be used as color, we change the color space to non-color. So that was all for this lesson. See you in the next one. Blender has very powerful set of texture painting tools, and it has a special texture painting mode. If you select the object and press Ctrl Tab, you can see texture paint mode here. You can change it from here too, or you can simply go to the texture painting workspace right there, and you will have this special workspace for painting textures. we have this 2D painting window and we can directly paint on 3D meshes too. If you have learned the sculpting tools in this course, you find that the texture painting tools are quite similar. And if you don't have this texture painting workspace for some reason, you can create one. Click on this plus sign, come here to General and choose Texture Paint. And you have this workspace ready for you. I will just close these panels because I will never use them. And I mostly prefer to paint directly on the 3D mesh, but sometimes we can paint on the 2D image, which is usually more performant and easier to handle for the computer. Now that we know how to go to the texture painting mode or texture painting workspace, we need to know one very important thing. In order to be able to paint textures on any mesh, we really need to have the UV maps of that mesh. So if you want to paint anything, you first need to unwrap the UVs. And then you'll plug in textures and you start painting. Once you have the texture paint workspace ready and you are ready for painting, you can start painting on this 3D model, right? This is the default cube and we try to paint on it and we can't because we are missing some textures here. You can see the message, missing textures. So this makes sense because in order to paint a texture, we need a texture in the first place. Where are the textures? Who created the textures for us? Well, no one. So we are going to create the textures ourselves and then we will be able to paint on it. There are a few ways to create textures in Blender, but the one which is easier for you to understand is through this shading workspace because we use textures for materials, right? For example, I'm going to paint on the cube. I want to paint it green, for example, or blue. We will use that painted texture in our material. So we go to shading, we look at the material. Yeah, we have one material, but we don't have any textures to paint on. We can't directly paint the base color, right? So what kind of texture do we need? An image texture, of course. Shift A, texture, image. You can bring in an external texture if you have them, but we can create a new texture right inside of Blender. So we have this image texture, we can click on new, we call it base color because we are going to paint base color. And we have this image resolution here, which is 1K right now, and it's square as you can see. We need to keep it square, and let's go with 2K. And this color is the initial color. We can change it to kind of grayscale color. It doesn't really matter. We don't need this alpha and we don't have to touch any other thing here. Let's create this new image. After we create the image, we can plug this right into our principled BSDF and we will see the effect. Now we can go back to texture painting and we can paint on it. Now we know how to create textures and set up for painting. We can test and learn more about the tools that we have for texture painting. So let's take a look at the tools that we have here. We have this brush tool, which is the default, and the brush tool has its corresponding brush settings here. And just like in sculpting, we can find them here, right here, and also in this end panel. So this is the primary tool that we use the most often. And then we have this blur tool, which you can use to blur any details, any sharp details. For example, draw something sharp, we can blur it using this blur tool. The next is smudge or smear, which is also a nice tool. And by the way, it's working much faster than before. In previous versions of Blender, these tools, we have this clone tool, which clones the part of the image under this cursor. You can change the cursor by holding down Shift and right-clicking anywhere. For example, if I want to clone this area, I can hold down Shift and right-click, and I will clone that area of the texture. The next tool is the fill tool, which I use a lot. It simply fills the entire texture with a specific color. And try to fill. As you can see, it filled the entire texture. So we are not going to use this mask tool. We will be using texture masks and other ways to mask. So it has been a quick introduction to texture painting tools. Now it's time for quick questions. So the first question, what do we need to do before we can paint textures on 3D models in Blender? Well, first of all, we need to find the tools, which we can find in Texture Paint workspace. But more importantly, we need to unwrap our 3D models and create the UV maps before we can paint on them. And secondly, we need to create the textures for painting purposes. Now, the next question is related to the first question. How do we create an image texture to paint on in Blender? Well, there are a few ways to create textures. I showed only one way, which is in Shading workspace. In the node editor, we can directly create textures and plug them into the material node, but you can also create them directly in the texture painting mode. From here in texture slots, you can click on this plus icon and create different textures for different purposes like base color, roughness, metallic, normal, etc. For example, if you want to create roughness texture, Blender will do a few things automatically. For example, it will give a default name like cube roughness. It will also give it grayscale default color. But that's not all. If we add the texture and go to shading, Blender created a material and assigned to the cube and also created the cube texture and plugged it into roughness. It also set the color space to non-color. So that's all for this lesson. See you in the next one. Now we can take a look at the brush properties and change a few settings, the most commonly used ones, of course. The first is the brush type. We already looked at some of them, for example, the clone tool, the blur tool, the smear tool, and others are actually types of this paint brush. For example, this is called paint hard, right? Let's change the color to white, for example. This is painting hard. And we have this paint soft, right, which paints a little softer. But we can change the paint hard brush and make it look like paint soft. For example, we can come here to fall off, change the fall off from custom to smoother, and we can paint, and it's exactly the same as paint soft brush we have right here. We also have these erase brushes, but they erase the alpha channel. This can be useful sometimes, but in our case, in this course, we are not going to use it. Just like that, you can see we are not deleting anything about the geometry. We are simply erasing the alpha channel of our texture. Let's undo that, Control Z. Next, we have this color picker. We have two colors to work with, and we can change between them by pressing X. For example, X to switch colors between these two. So regarding colors, we can sample colors anywhere on the screen by pressing Shift X and holding down Shift X. You can see we can sample colors, but this doesn't always work for some reason. I don't know why. In that case, you can come here, use this color picker and pick any color from the screen. And next to colors, we have this blending options. And if you have used any painting software before, you're probably familiar with that. And mix is the normal mode, which we are going to use. So we are not going to touch anything there. And the radius and strength of the brush, they are self-explanatory. Press F to change the radius, Shift F to change the strength. And apart from the color, we also have this gradient option. Let me quickly show this because it's an interesting one, although we don't use it in this course. By default, it's black and white, but we can change the color, for example, from green to blue, and we can paint. It's only painting blue, but we can change the mapping option from pressure to repeat and change the space to, for example, 200 pixels. Now we can paint with gradient. Let me fill this real quick with white color and then use the gradient brush. You can increase the space to 400 pixel. You can also change it from repeat to clamp, which will not repeat the color. You can increase the space So the gradient is also a nice coloring option. When we are painting with a color, we can randomize it by turning on randomize color and changing these properties like hue, for example, and you can randomize the color like that. We also have the color palette. We have one default palette. We have lots of colors here. You can also add your own color. For example, if you have chosen one color and you want to add, you can simply press plus and this is your color. You can sort the colors, you can move the colors as you can see here. We have a ton of other settings here, but we are going to look at the most important ones for this course. Texture mask, we will look at this in the next lesson. Let's take a quick look at the stroke. Currently we have stroke method set as space, which is a common option. We also have, for example, dots, which if we turn on jitter, it will look quite interesting. And another very common one is line, when we want to draw straight lines. Of course, we need to bring down the jitter. And the fall off, we looked at it, I think. We can change it to constant. So we also have symmetry options right here. As you can see, we have options. This bleed is an important one. It allows us to extend the color little out of the UV map bounds. By default, we have 2 pixels, and you can see it better if you come closer to the UV map. I just changed the colors for you to see it better. Let's increase it to 20 pixels and try painting, and you can see we have extended the paint outside the UV boundaries, UV limits. So this is useful to cover the seams. For example, if we don't have any bleed, maybe a different color, and you might see some lines along the seams like this black line. To show you this better, let's add subdivision surface modifier. Let's go back to texture painting. Now you see these black lines clearly. These are the seams, and if we have bleed like 2 pixels, we won't see these seams because the bleeding will cover these and hide them, just like that. So bleed is an important one. The occlude and back face culling options allow us to paint on the faces that we don't see. By default, we can't paint on the faces that we don't see, just like that, as you can see. But if we turn these options off, we can paint on the other side. Let me quickly fill. By default, we can't paint on the other side. But if we turn these options off, we can paint on the other side. As you can see, we still can't paint on some areas. We can fix this by coming here to fall off and turn off normal fall off. I will show you how it works. With normal fall off on, we can't paint on certain areas, even if we turn off occlude and back face culling. But when we turn off normal fall off, now we can paint through the object without any problems. And now it's time for quick questions. Let's start the quick questions, and as always, please pause the video after each question. Go ahead and try to find the answer yourself. The first question: what is the shortcut to switch the colors you are painting? That's pretty easy. You are using 2 colors and you can switch between them by pressing X. Next question: what is the shortcut to sample colors from the screen? Also very simple. You hold down Shift plus X. Remember, you don't release, you just hold down and you move the cursor, and when you find a nice color, you can release the buttons. Next question: what can you do if you want to draw straight lines? Maybe this one was a bit trickier, right? So we go to stroke properties and we change the stroke type from space to line, and then we can draw straight lines. The next question: what can you do if you want to paint through the mesh object? By default, you cannot paint through. You can only paint the faces which are under the brush, but you can change a few things to be able to paint through. The first is to disable occlude and backface culling options, and in the fall off options you can turn off normal fall off, and this way you can paint through. That was all for this lesson. I hope to see you in the next one. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use textures and texture masks for texture painting. Well, let's go to texture paint mode and create a texture. We can create a texture by coming to shading workspace, and in the node editor, we could create an image texture, or we can create image textures directly in the texture paint mode. For that, we come to texture slots and click on this plus icon, choose the type of texture that we're going to paint. Let's choose the base color. I don't generally like to leave empty spaces between words. You can select the initial color and add this texture. This way you not only create the texture, but also plug it into the correct material property. As you can see, it plugged it into the base color, and if you create a different type of texture, for example roughness, just a test, it will correctly plug it into the roughness input in your material. You can choose which texture to paint on in this texture slot menu, and you can paint the textures. So far we have learned a few things about texture painting in Blender, but we still haven't learned how to save the textures that we painted. Maybe it's because we haven't painted any good textures yet, but anyway, if you want to save these textures as image files on your computer, you come to this image editor, find the texture that you're painting on, and come to this image menu and click save. Choose location and create a folder, ideally a folder called textures, and save your texture file there. And when you paint new details on the texture, you notice that you have this asterisk icon next to this image menu, which means there are some changes which aren't saved. In order to save them, you can come here and press save. Also, there is a less safe option, which is here, clicking the save all images, but I wouldn't recommend doing this because you might save something that you don't want to, and this will also try to save all the images which aren't actually saved externally, and Blender simply embeds those image files into this blend file, which might not be what you want. Now that we have learned how to save the paint textures, we're going to learn more about textures, and especially using a texture to create new textures. So let's come here to texture options, and the slot is currently empty. We can create a new texture, press new, and call it anything, for example grass, but it's currently empty. We need to bring in a texture. Usually we use an external texture. Creating a texture here and creating a texture right there is completely different. This is a place where we bring in external textures and use those textures to paint new textures. So I hope you understand what I mean. I will show you how it works in a moment. And we also have the texture mask, where we normally bring in black and white textures, and we will mask the color based on black and white information. I will show you that too. For now, let's bring in a color texture. For that, we can go to texture settings. As you can see, we have this grass texture, its type is image, and here we can open and import an external texture. I'm going to bring in this ground texture, and now we can paint using this ground texture. We can't see the texture detail now because we are using a different color, the wrong color, which is black, and we are trying to mix it with the color, which doesn't work. We need to use white color. Now we paint the grass texture. Currently we are trying to paint using view plane. With view plane method, the texture moves along with the brush and leaves its trail like that. Let's look from a different angle and test it. And we can use tiled option to make things much better. Here you can see this is working much better. Now if you go closer to the 2D image, you can see it's very pixelated because the texture resolution is too small. It's 1K, so it doesn't retain details very well. If we increase the resolution to, for example, 4K, it would look much better. But it's just for a demonstration. So while tiled is good for painting, view plane can be good for projecting. Now another mapping method is 3D, which is only useful for procedural textures. Image textures like we have here, do not make use of that, so we can skip it now. Random, well, this applies different texture coordinate at each step of brush stroke, so this can also be used for painting. And we have this stencil. Stencil is ideal for projection, especially if you want to stamp an image or a character face, or you might want to stamp a logo on the surface. So use stencil for those purposes. Let me bring in a different texture to demonstrate that. Now I'll tell you how to control, how to move or scale this stencil image. You use right click to move the stencil image. You hold down Shift and drag with right click to scale it up or down. You hold down Control and right click to rotate it. You move it with right click. So it's mostly right click because left click is used for drawing or painting. Now let's paint this leaf texture on this side of the cube. I think it's looking nice. Let's reset the transform, which puts the image back to the lower left corner of the screen. Now you can see we have painted the texture of the leaf. So stencil mode can be effectively used to project images with a lot of control. Now let's go back to the previous texture, change this to random, and we will look at a few other options, which is angle. Well, you change the angle or rotation of the texture by pressing Ctrl F, and it's the same thing here. For example, as you can see, the number is 90 now, and it changed here too. And the next thing is rake. Let's fill this with a solid color in order to show you how this works, and use the leaf texture. Actually, we go back to view plane mapping method and try painting. So this is how it paints without rake is turned on. So these are about texture rotation. So when you enable rake, the texture rotation follows the brush stroke direction, as you can see here. So this is what rake does, and random does what it says. It randomizes the rotation of the texture, as you can see here. Offset moves the texture. For example, if I click once, you can see the texture here, but if I move it along x-axis a little, it will be moved. Let's move it along y-axis. And the scale also does what it says. If we decrease the scale from here, we will have larger texture. If we increase, we will have smaller texture. So these are pretty simple. And the texture mask options are almost the same here. So let's get rid of any textures here. For texture masks, we mostly use black and white textures, and they control the strength of the brush color. So let's bring in a black and white texture. Let's call it, maybe go to texture properties, bring in a black and white texture. So I brought in this simple black and white texture. Now here is how it works. The black parts are ignored and we don't paint anything on the black parts. We only paint on the white part. To show you that, let's go to color, change the color and fill with one color, maybe with black color, right? Go back to the brush, change the color to something, and let's check it. As you can see, I painted only the white part and the black parts are ignored. These options are all the same, so we don't worry about them. But one thing we can talk about is using procedural textures instead of external image files. We can come to texture properties. As you can see, we can click on this and come to texture properties and change the type from image to, for example, clouds. This is a procedural black and white texture. We can change the noise type to this one, for example, and we can change the color using this color ramp to create black and white patches. And we paint only on those white spots. Let me quickly fill it with a kind of solid color. Go back, change the color a little, maybe a little darker, and use this texture mask and paint. Mapping method to tiled. No, let's change it to random. And now you can see I'm painting this random scratch or whatever you call it. We can randomize the rotation. These can be skin pores or whatever you want to simulate. So that's all. Now it's time for quick questions. The questions are quite simple, I hope. How do you save the textures that you have painted? Well, you come to Image Editor and go to Image menu and save it from there. And I highly recommend saving the texture externally after you have created it from here. And the next change can be saved from here in the texture paint mode. You have the texture slots here. You can save all changes by clicking this button. The next question, how do you set up a colored brush texture? So by colored brush texture, I mean using a texture for brush color. So the way you set up is very simple. You come here to texture panel, you create new, call it whatever you want. And to bring in the texture, you go to texture properties and you can open and import the texture and you go back to tool settings. Don't forget to change the color to white, otherwise you won't be able to paint. Now you can paint with the texture. The next question, what is the main difference between texture and texture mask options? Well, the difference is quite obvious. You use the texture options for painting specific textures like a wall or a grass. And another difference is for texture mask, you mostly use black and white textures, where the white means fully opaque and black means transparent. So that was all for this lesson. I hope to see you in the next one. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to paint and use black and white textures in Blender. Now let's go to shading mode and see the power of black and white color. So to create a simple color, we can do a lot of things here, but the simplest way is to use the RGB node, Shift A, Input, RGB. Let's change the color to complete white, and you can Control Shift click to see the color. It didn't change because it's white. We can change it to any color. If Control Shift click doesn't work, again, you should enable the Node Wrangler add-on. Add-ons, Node Wrangler, enable that, and Shift D and change this color to black. Control Shift click and you can see it's black. Now, here's the most important thing. These two colors, black and white, will control the numbers, where white is 1, black is 0, and anything in between is the numbers between 1 and 0. To see that in action, let's change the roughness. When we bring the roughness down to 0, there is, well, 0 roughness, and our material is completely smooth and reflective. With 100% roughness, there is no smoothness and light gets scattered away, and there is no reflections. So we can do that with the colors too. Again, remember it's important. White is 1 and black is 0. And any color in between, which is the grayscale colors, are the numbers between 1 and 0. So plugging white color into roughness is the same as changing the number to 1. Plugging black into roughness is the same as changing the number to 0. And we can control the number by changing the color, just like that. And because you can control the numbers with simple black and white color, we normally control the mix factor values with colors. Shift A, color, mix color. Let's use two colors, blue and maybe green. And this factor is also from 0 to 1. And if we plug white into factor, it will mean 1. And as you can see, it will switch only the second color, which is B. 0 will switch to the first color, which is A. And any number between these two will mix these two colors. Now you might be saying, what's the point of using these two colors? We can simply control the numbers here, right? By sliding them. But things get a little more interesting when we use black and white patterns. And it will get even more interesting when we paint black and white color, right? So let's quickly demonstrate that with checker texture. Texture, we have a checker texture, I hope. Control-Shift-Click. This is what it does. Let's change the colors to black and white. And let's plug this into roughness. And I hope you know what's going to happen. Let's plug this into roughness. And this is what happens when you have black and white color controlling any number. Could you do the same with by changing this number alone? Of course not. And now I think you probably understand the power of black and white. Now to make things a little more interesting, we're going to create an image texture and paint black and white values. And generally you want to start with grayscale color, not complete white and complete black, because you often use grayscale image and you don't often see completely white or black textures. So let's create a grayscale one. Let's plug this into roughness. It's about 0.5 roughness. So let's go to texture painting. Now let's paint with white, or press X to switch colors and paint with black. Let's go back to shading and see the effect. I think I'm going to paint on the top. So as you can see, it gives us a lot of flexibility to control these values. Shift A, for example, we can use a bump node and use this as a height map. Change the distance a little. And because we have a grayscale texture, we can see the effect of both black and white. If our texture was completely white, we couldn't have seen the effect of white values here. So that's why you generally start with grayscale texture. Now we will do something a bit more useful with this knowledge. Imagine we're going to paint the shoes. I just copied it from the main project. It's not the original project, it's just a copy. And I will demonstrate some painting techniques with this. Let's go to texture painting. As you can see, this is the UV map. It's very small because it's sharing the UV map with other objects, but we don't worry about that now. Let's create a texture. It doesn't matter what kind of texture it is. We call it separate and use this grayscale texture. Now let's say we want to have some sort of metal part here. Actually, I'm going to paint with softer brush. And in order to paint perfect lines, we can change the stroke from space to line. Let's say this is a metal part, and this is all we need to do. We can go to shading. We can use this texture to separate color, mix color. And by the way, this is just a demonstration. I'm not going to do exactly the same thing with our real character model. We might do something similar, but yeah, this is just demo. Let's use the color as a factor and use two different colors. Bluish color for the shoes and a little yellow for the metal part. This will be metal part, remember? And we will use this for metallic. This part is more metal. If we want to exaggerate the effect, we can use the converter color ramp, and we can see what's happening by holding down Control-Shift and left clicking on it. We can see the colors, and we can exaggerate the blacks and the white if we want. Let's plug this into roughness. And we need to invert the values. Shift A, invert, so that the metal part is smooth, but it's too much. We can decrease this. Finally, we can also use this as the bump map. Shift A, bump. Let's plug it into height, normal to normal. Now let's change the color to more darker color. And if this doesn't work very well, we can use another color ramp, which will exaggerate the effect. Now we can add any more metal parts by painting this single texture. Control 1 to look from the back. Let's say I want some metal parts right here, just like that. Go back to shading, and the metal parts are ready. So that's how to paint non-color textures like grayscale textures and how to use them. Now it's time for quick questions. Again, after each question, please pause the video and think about the question, come up with an answer before moving to the next question. First question is quite simple. Why are black and white colors important in materials? Well, because they control the numbers, linear numbers from 0 to 1, where black means 0 and 1 means white or white means 1, and the grayscale colors are the numbers between 0 and 1. Next question. How do black and white colors control the mix factor in materials in Blender? Mix factors are also numbers from 0 to 1. 1 switches on the second slot, 0 switches on the first slot, and you can control this with colors, where white means 1 and switch the second color, and black is 0, which switch the first color, and black and white patterns can mix these colors. So that was all for this lesson. See you in the next one. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about texture baking. Baking or baking textures is the process about saving information related to a 3D mesh into a texture file. Essentially, it's an image file, and very often this process involves another mesh, and in this case, the information from the first mesh are transferred onto the second mesh using UVs and then baked into a texture. And by the way, this is not my definition, it's coming from the Adobe Substance website, and you can always come back to this definition. And I think you can understand it better when we demonstrate it. Here we have two cubes, and as you can see, they have the same detail. Now here's what's interesting about them. I modeled the details on one of them, and another is using baked texture. So in this case, baked normal map. So I mean, one of them has the details modeled at geometry level, and another is using baked texture. So which one do you think has the details at geometry level, and which one is faking the details using normal map? So to see that, let's go to solid shaded view. And as you can see, the second mesh is a default cube with only 6 faces, but the first mesh has the details at geometry level, which are modeled in edit mode. And the first cube has about 2000 triangles. The second cube only has 12 triangles. So the first, although it looks relatively simple, has 200 times more polygons than the second. But in rendered view, they look almost identical. Now that you have learned what baking is and what it can do, you probably understand the why part. Why we even have to bother learning it. So what's the reason for baking? Yes, you're right, to reduce performance cost or to improve the performance. With baking, you can capture not only these model details, but also sculpted details which requires millions of polygons. You simply bake those details onto a texture and apply the texture on a retopologized simplified mesh, which has 1,000 times less polygons. But not only that, you can bake light information, which is very common in video games, because lighting also requires a lot of processing power. By baking the light information like specularity, reflections, or shadows onto textures, you significantly improve performance. In Blender, we can also bake materials created by complex node setups into single image textures, because as the material gets complex, it will be much harder to calculate. It is real-time calculation, so it really slows down the interaction in the scene. And if it's a texture, the computer simply loads the image onto memory and displays it, and no more complex calculations required. Also a significant performance boost option. Now that we understand what baking is, what it does, and why we need it, we can learn how to bake geometry details onto normal maps. Now imagine you have modeled this model with these fine details, and you want to capture these details onto a texture and apply the texture to a lower poly version of this model. And I intentionally created this model out of default cube because I would like to use default cube as the low poly version. Let's create a default cube. And the next thing, which is important, is that the low poly and high poly mesh must overlap or must be in the same place, same position. Actually, they don't really need to overlap. We can scale it up or down and change a few configurations in the baking settings to get things work. So let's scale the low poly version down. Remember, the default cube is the low poly version. Let's scale it down so that we don't see that annoying flickering. We can bake in this way too, but remember, all the faces should match at least, and the meshes should be in the same position, because Blender bakes the textures by casting rays from the low poly to the high poly and capture the details. And if the two meshes are in different positions, it doesn't happen. And the next requirement is the low poly mesh must have UV maps. So let's quickly check it. It has a UV map because default cube already has a UV map. But if it's a custom model, you need to UV unwrap it. Without UVs, baking doesn't work. So that step is done for us too. The next step is to actually create that texture. So select the low poly version, create a new material. We create the texture through material. Now let's create an image texture. Normal, maybe 2K, new image. Now we can open this image texture in the image editor so that we can see what's happening. Now you need to take the following steps. First of all, the newly created image texture must be active selection. Otherwise, baking won't work, or we might bake onto the wrong texture. Second step is to select the objects in a specified order. So the order is this. We need to select the high poly mesh first and shift select the low poly next, so that the low poly version is the active selection. To simplify this process, you can select the low poly mesh and box select these two objects, and the low poly mesh will be active selection, and it's highlighted in brighter yellow color. Now we should find the bake panel, which is in Cycles Render Properties, because baking is similar to rendering. So in Cycles Render Properties, we have bake panel, and the first thing we need to do is to change the bake type to normal, because we're going to bake normal map. The next thing we need to do is to enable selected to active, because we are baking the details of the selected object to the active selection. And we will change a few things here, depending on the result we will see now. We don't need to do anything here. The margin, it will stay as it is. So let's test baking. Well, the yellow colors indicate that something is wrong, because the normal map, as you have seen, is usually a kind of purple color. This is happening because we need to change the distance here. And the general rule is when the low poly is inside the high poly mesh, when it's smaller, you should increase the extrusion distance. But if the low poly mesh is larger and enclosing the high poly mesh, we can change this max ray distance. So it's more like an iterative process. You should try and test different numbers and choose what works best for you. So let's increase the extrusion number to 0.4 maybe. And now we will test baking. So it worked very well, I think. Now we can plug this in through normal map. Shift A, normal map. We can hide the high poly mesh, go to material preview, and see the details on the low poly mesh. Well, you probably need to watch this part of the video a few times and repeat the process until you get things right, but I hope you will do very soon. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, we can bake other things such as complex node groups onto single image textures in Blender. However, we are not going to utilize that technique in this course, but if you really want to learn that, you can check out our other courses here. And that was all for this lesson. Now it's time for quick questions. So the first question, what is baking textures? Well, baking textures is the process of capturing data about a geometry onto an image texture. Next question, what can we bake on image textures? We mentioned three things mostly, but we can bake other things. The first is geometry details like modeled or sculpted details. Next is light information like shadows and reflections. And lastly, we mentioned that we can bake complex node groups onto single images. Well, probably the most important question, but the simplest one, why do we need baking? We need baking simply to improve performance. So that was all for this lesson. See you in the next one. Now in this lesson we are going to learn how multi-resolution modifier works and how to bake multi-res details onto image textures. To demonstrate that, I brought this shirt in here. Again, I'm not modifying the original character, I simply copied its shirt. Now, let's say I don't like this very plain look of the shirt and I'd like to sculpt some wrinkles, some folds on the shirt. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to sculpting, Shift B. I want to sculpt very fine folds here. Yeah, let's go. And it's not very fine, as you can see. Even though my brush size is very small, I can't sculpt fine details. It's simple because I don't have. Now, how can I get those smaller polygons and sculpt fine details? Well, we can turn on dynamic topology, but you really don't want to do that on the shirt, because we have done a lot of work retopologizing it and we have UV unwrapped it, as you can see. And since dynamic topology destroys all of that, we don't want to turn on dynamic topology. Well, maybe we can go back and add subdivision surface modifier, right? Let's add subdivision surface with multiple levels. Yeah, it's very fine now. Let's turn off optimal display. Very fine topology. Let's go back to sculpting and try to sculpt on this level of the. And it doesn't work for some reason. Let's decrease the brush size and try to sculpt, and it doesn't look like it's working. And actually it's not working because we are still sculpting on the base mesh, the unsubdivided version of the mesh. We can't sculpt on subdivision surface modifier. It simply doesn't work in Blender. So what can we do then? Well, you are right, we are going to use multi-resolution modifier. Multi-resolution modifier is the subdivision surface modifier only for sculpting. So we can subdivide the mesh multiple times and we can sculpt on it. This is a really powerful modifier which allows us to sculpt fine details on this clean, retopologized mesh. And there is something even more magical about multi-resolution modifier, and we are going to see it a bit later. First, let's quickly go over what we have here. We have viewport levels, the levels that we can see. We have sculpt levels. On that level, we will sculpt, and the render levels, which is easy. It will show this level when you are rendering. We have the subdivision part. This is the thing that we use the most. Generate and other things, but we're not going to touch them. But this reshape button, I think I'm going to show how this works. Now we have subdivided multiple times. Now we can go to sculpting and test if we can sculpt anything on this level. And as you can see, now we can sculpt. And this is why multi-resolution is such a powerful tool. Now we can sculpt the wrinkles. For that, let's take the crease sharp brush and try to sculpt some wrinkles. I think it's too sharp. Let's bring the strength down. You can hold down Control to invert the effect. I think we need a little more resolution. Let's subdivide a bit more. Maybe 5 levels of subdivision is enough. Maybe we had better use the crease brush instead of crease sharp. Let's use the crease brush. Now we have seen the power of multi-resolution modifier. We're going to see another magic button that it provides us. So it allows us to bake these details very easily onto a normal map. So let's see that. For that, let's go to shading, give it a simple material, bring in an image texture. Let's create actually one normal, change the color space to non-color, and please keep this image texture active. Now you'll see the magic happen in front of your eyes. Let's go to Cycles Render Properties, go to Bake Options, and remember we already have a UV map of our shirt. We can go to UV Editing and select everything to see the UV map. We already have that. And here we have the option called Bake from Multi-Res, which means we bake the multi-resolution details onto a texture. Let's enable this. And we have this normals option. We also have displacement, but we need normals. And before clicking on this magic bake button, we have one more step to do. We need to go back to multi-resolution modifier and set the levels viewport to 0. Because during baking, Blender will compare the details of the final sculpt level with the viewport level and capture the difference onto an image texture. So let's go back to bake option. And now we can click on bake. Now let's see, let's go to image editor, look at the normal map, and now we have this details baked on the normal map. Let's see how they work. Normal map, plug to the correct sockets, plug the normal map, and let's go to material preview. And as you can see, we have the details. If you don't see it very well, rotate. And here they are. You can see the details on the clean mesh, which only has around 1,000 polygons. But we captured the details from 1,000,000 polygons right there. As you can see, 1,100,000. So this is the power of multi-resolution modifier. And you can maybe use one level of subdivision if you want, which increased the poly count to about more than 4,000. But it's still fine. Even with 0 subdivisions, it looks much better. So the questions are quite simple. The first question, what is the main purpose of multi-resolution modifier? Well, the main purpose of multi-res modifier is to allow us to sculpt fine details on top of clean retopologized mesh, and it will also allow us to bake those fine details onto a normal map. The next question, what do you need to be able to use multi-resolution modifier? Well, you need to have a clean retopologized mesh. That's the most important thing. And it's also important to unwrap the mesh before you use multi-resolution modifier. What are the steps to bake multi-res details? Well, I showed that it's quite simple. As the requirement, it should have clean topology and also need to be unwrapped. It should have UV maps. Then you need to bring down the level viewport count to 0. Then the next step will be to create an image texture inside this node editor. Then you come to Cycles Render Properties, to Bake menu, and simply enable Bake from Multi-Res. It will automatically select normals, and you will click Bake. So that was all for this lesson. I hope to see you in the next one. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to bake node setups onto texture maps. I created this very simple wall model and I unwrapped it. It has UV maps because you need UV maps for baking. I also created a simple brick material. So I created this material using this built-in brick texture, which is a procedural texture, and a few other nodes, for example, the noise texture for this roughness map. You can play with and create much better bricks. But this is to demonstrate how to bake this information onto textures. So we're going to use emission node for that. So let's bring in a emission node. So this is the color texture, color information. Let's see how it looks. This is color information. This is roughness map. We're also using the color information as a bump map, so we don't have to bake that separately. Now, the way we do this is we need to plug each of this information through emission node, just like that, as you can see, and we will bake this information through emission node. Let's come here to Cycles properties, and please make sure that your model has UV maps. Come down to bake, and bake type emit. We need emit. You don't have to do anything else here, but we need a texture to bake onto. That's it. Now let's select the object and also select the texture and hit bake. Now let's check if baking actually worked. Here it is. It worked. Now let's go back to rendered view, plug this onto the base color and check if it works. Yeah, it's working just like before. And then this roughness map, let's bake that too. It's the same process. Shift A. So roughness map is also baked. Now we can get rid of all these nodes. Now this is our material setup. It's quite simple now, right? Now we will quickly look at why this process is important. First, because they are textures, you can export them to other programs and they look exactly the same as they are in Blender. But if they stay as node setups, you will have to create them from scratch in a different program. Also, baked textures look exactly the same in Cycles and Eevee. And more importantly, the textures are better for performance, for example, for games. You can export baked textures, and the textures are not easily broken if you don't delete them. But for node setups, with a small mistake, entire material might break. And finally, it's obvious you can paint on them, but you cannot paint node setups. However, this all doesn't mean that you should never use node setups. They have their own advantages. For example, they're procedural. You can always come back and change something. Also, you can keep working with them if your project is only inside Blender and you are not planning to export it anywhere. But baked textures are better for these reasons. Now it's time for quick questions. So the questions for this video are really simple. The first question, which node did we use to bake node setups? So if you ever forgot, it was an emission node and we chose the emit option in bake settings. The next question, very obvious, what are some advantages of baked textures? Well, you can look back at this list and see the advantages of baked textures. So that was all for this lesson. See you in the next one. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to bake ambient occlusion maps and also why they are useful. I borrowed the trousers from our character again. And as you can see, we have these fine sculpted details. I used multi-resolution modifier. You learned how to do that in previous videos. Actually, I have created a material. Let's see that. You can see some areas, especially between these folds. The color is slightly darker, even there is no shadow. And this is because of the ambient occlusion. You can also see that there is whiter parts which are generated using curvature map, but all of this is usually baked onto the color map at the end. Again, you can see all these effects even without multi-race modifier. I can easily delete that because it has done its job. So now let's learn how to create the ambient occlusion effect. We will definitely create this material in one of the future videos, not in this video. In this video, we will learn only how to create and bake ambient occlusion effect. Let's select this brand new material, go to shading, render cycles, because ambient occlusion works better in cycles. Let's go to rendered view, bring in ambient occlusion node, Control Shift click, see what it's doing. It creates these shadows in occluded areas. We can bring down the distance to create shadows in smaller crevices and remove some larger shadows. And if we enable the multi-race modifier, you can see the effects a little better. We can also use color ramp to exaggerate this effect. We can always paint the black areas out, but we can also bring down the distance to 0.02. And you can see the effect is limited to smaller areas. We can change the color slightly because we need to generally avoid using complete white and complete black. And the rest of the process is the same as we learned in the previous video, which is using emission node. You don't always have to use emission node, but it is much safer. Now let's select this object and create an image texture for ambient occlusion map. Now select the newly created texture, go to render properties, bake panel, change bake type to emit and bake. We can see the result. So this is trousers ambient occlusion, and we can plug this into base color and see how it looks. This is how it looks. It's just an image texture. Don't forget to save it to keep it. Now we can mix this information with any color. And as you can see, occluded areas are a darker version of this color. Well, we have learned how to create and bake ambient occlusion effect. Let's see in what situations it can be useful. So we can use ambient occlusion map to create real-time shadows in occluded areas. We can also use it to help separate concave areas, occluded areas of the mesh, to apply effects like accumulated dirt. We can also use it to improve color texture. Well, we have learned how to create, how to bake, and how to use ambient occlusion map. Now it's time for quick questions. How do we create the ambient occlusion map? Well, the most important node is ambient occlusion node. We can use the color or ambient occlusion information. You can also increase the samples for better quality. The insight we will talk about in the next lesson. And if you turn on only local, Blender will not take into account any other objects in the scene when calculating the ambient occlusion effect. For example, I will bring in a simple cube. It's too big. Put it anywhere, actually. Now let's go to rendered view. And as you can see, currently Blender is taking into account the cube and creating ambient occlusion effect all around. But if you turn on only local, cube will not be taken into account. You don't often change the color. We talked about the distance, and we will talk about the normal in the future videos. The next question, why is ambient occlusion map useful? Well, you can take a look at this information again and learn why it can be useful. We will be using ambient occlusion map for improving our materials in the future videos. And that's all for this lesson. See you in the next one. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create and bake curvature maps. A curvature map is a map that separates the sharper edges of your 3D mesh. And you can see the image of this bolt, and the sharper edges, as you can see, are separated and they have wear and tear effect. So curvature maps can help us to create these. And in our case, it can also help us separate the edges. You can see in this material that the edges of the mesh have this faded effect. So let's separate those edges. It's simple. We simply turn on Insight on ambient occlusion node. And for curvature map, we normally bring this distance down by a lot, 0.02 or something. And we play with the colors. And this way we can separate those edges and bake this effect onto a texture map. As always, select the trouser, select the image texture, go to render properties, change this to emit, but we forgot to bring in the emission node. And as you can see, this is our curvature map. We can use it to fine-tune our material. Well, that's all for this lesson. It was really short. Now you have a small exercise. Please bake both textures, ambient occlusion and curvature map, before you move on to the next lesson. And I will see you in the next lesson. Finally, after a long break, we are back with our character, and in this lesson we are going to prepare her for texturing. So let's get started. First of all, we will organize the objects in the scene by renaming them. So please rename all the different parts of your character respectively. You can check any other objects in the scene which are not renamed. Yes, this is tongue. Now you can put these objects in collections by some sort of category, but I'm just going to put the mouth objects in one collection. And that's all. I'm not going to organize any other thing here, but it's up to you. You can organize different parts even further. I named the collection teeth, gums, and tongue, whatever you want. Now we can start to create materials and textures. Remember, we unwrapped some parts of our object at the same time and they share the UV map. That's why it's logical to apply the same material to those objects. For example, the skin parts of our object share the UV maps, so we apply the body or skin texture to all of that. So let's call the material body, and we apply the same material to other body parts. For that, we can select the parts without the material first, and lastly the body part with the material, and press Ctrl L, link materials. Now these objects also share that material. And when we create a texture, they share the texture too, because they already share the UV map. And the eyes, eyelashes, eyebrows, inner mouth objects, all these share a UV map, so they will share a material too. We have the material called eyes, but we rename it. I simply called it small parts, SM parts, but you can call it whatever you want. And we select everything. We'll link the material to other objects. I think there is some viewport display transparency here. Let's increase it. Now again, the clothes share one UV map, but actually you can create different materials to different parts of the clothes. But since they already share the UV map, they will share a texture and it's more effective. So let's rename this to clothes and link other parts. And as you can see, the color is transferred too, but we can paint the textures and change the color. Now you can come here in material properties and see how many materials we have. We only have 4 materials, and we are going to create textures for them, except for hair, because we are not using textures for hair, at least in this course. So let's go to shading. Let's create the texture, Shift A. You should give textures names which are named after the material. So we can call it clothes base color or just color. And for this, I'm going to use 4K texture. The initial color is grayscale. Doesn't matter too much. But don't forget to save this texture now. You can save the texture by changing to image editor. Remember, we should save it externally. Clothes color. Let's save it. So it's a general convention to create a folder called textures or character textures and save all the textures in the project in that folder. So I'm going to save clothes color in textures folder, but be careful with the location. You had better create the folder just next to the blend file. Now I'll do the same with the other parts of the character. So that was it. Now it's time for a small exercise, and you know what the exercise is going to be. Please organize the project, rename the different objects respectively, create the materials, link the materials, and create textures. And don't forget to save the textures. Please do all of this before moving to the next lesson.